Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C. The events of the past week have presented us with a truly horrifying perspective. Fascist forces gathering from Syria to Ukraine. Enemies of civilization. Anarchy, chaos, massacres, destruction, and all of this with the support of the U.S. State Department and our lunatic Secretary of State, John Forbes, alias Skull and Bones Kerry. One of the common denominators of this entire tragic and appalling situation is that John Forbes Kerry of Skull and Bones has lost all contact with reality. And I invite you to look back to the time of the neocons, to the time of Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and Shulsky and Feith and the rest of them. And you remember that famous quote, the differentiation between the reality-based community, which tries to understand things through causes by reason, and the essentially voluntaristic Schopenhauerian Nietzschean forces of the neocons who simply believe that reality does not exist and that you make your own reality by purely irrational, ultra-subjectivist decisions. I think, in effect, the Heideggerian existentialist view, but with a large base in terms of world politics and so forth. If we look at Kerry in comparison to Bush, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Feith, Shulsky, we will see that Kerry's relation to reality is weaker and more tenuous. In other words, he is a bigger lunatic than they ever were. And you can see this in his speech and associated remarks at the Geneva conference on Syria between Montreux and Syria this week. He seems to believe, he seems to have convinced himself that the vast majority, as he says, almost exclusively, the people who have gotten killed in Syria have been killed by the Assad regime, thinks Kerry. Now, does that include when the rebels kill each other, Secretary Kerry? Does that include when the Nusra Brigade kills the Islamic Front and the Islamic Front kills the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and Sham, and they all kill the Free Syrian Army? Does that also redound against Assad? As Kerry pointed out, or tried to convince the world, Assad is a magnet for terrorism. There is no greater reason, there's no greater cause for terrorism than Assad. Isn't this blaming the victim? Isn't this taking the blowback theory to a very extreme form? And naturally, if you want to know who is a bigger cause of terrorism in Syria than Assad, I would say Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia, the CIA, Rafik, the Hariri family of Lebanon, the DGSE of France, the MI6 of Britain, the Mossad, certainly, and others, forces in Jordan, I'm sure, and so forth. In other words, there are far greater causes of the presence of terrorists in Syria. How about the people who put them there? So blame the victim and attempt to convince the world of this. Now, does Kerry believe this stuff? If he's lying and he knows he's lying, this is bad. But worse is that he really believes what he's saying. In which case, he is ripe for a straitjacket, a canvas blazer, for being committed, the loony bin, the funny farm. This is where Kerry needs to be put. And this is dangerous because, as he mumbled in the course of his speech there at Montreux, the option of military force has never been taken off the table. Is he serious? He wants to start a war? He'll end up impeached if he's lucky. Otherwise, he'll end up in some even more uncomfortable position. But certainly, impeached will be the lucky ones. Will be the ones who get impeached. So this is now a grave danger to the world. And these symptoms, right, the mental disintegration of Kerry, the schizophrenia and hysteria and paranoia of Kerry have now reached critical crisis proportions. And this extends from the death squads of Syria to the fascist mob of Kiev. They're all being supported by the United States. This is being done in our name. This is absolutely intolerable. Now, we're going to go through the Ukrainian situation. We want to give you a good rundown on this. We also want to talk about economics, right? The instability that I've begun to talk about in the past couple of weeks has now broken out into the open, right? We've got some significant turbulence here in the New York stock market, and similarly a reflection of this in the Treasury bond market. But let's look first of all at this Geneva conference. First of all, the pattern that we've got, right? Syria, Ukraine. It is reminiscent to some extent of the 1956 autumn crisis, where we had the Egypt, we had the attack on the Suez Canal by the British, the French, and the Israelis, 1956, and the Hungarian rebellion. Something similar now going on, right? The same kind of pattern. One event in the Middle East and one event in Eastern Europe, and these are geographically rather close to where they were then. But the difference, of course, is that now the United States is on the side of fascism. Are we facing a new fascist era? These are obviously forces that tend towards the destruction of the modern state. They are hooligans, they are gangs, neo-Nazis, with the various cultural connotations there in the situation of Syria. It's interesting that Jarba, the delegate of the death squads in Syria, tried to argue that Assad is playing the role of the Nazi. I'm sorry, if we go back and compare this to, say, the Spanish Civil War, Franco the fascist, supported by Hitler, this looks very much like the Syrian death squads, or the Sudeten Germans, supported by Hitler. That looks pretty much like the rebellion, the terrorist rebels there in Syria, or indeed other examples that we could bring. But a new fascist era brought on out of the desperation of finance capital their inability to continue their domination of the world, their attempt to reorganize the world to some extent so that they can continue for another 50 or 100 years, or whatever they tell them, whatever they're telling themselves in Davos this week. But let's take a look at some of the details of the event there in Switzerland. It is reminiscent in some ways of these big events like the Congress of Vienna 1815 or the Versailles Conference 1919. This was a kind of a showcase of the different personalities. And who did we have, right? First of all, the Syrian delegation, people like Moallem and Jafari, monuments of dignity because of what they represent. These are not individual characteristics so much as you can gain dignity and status within history based on what your program is, based on what you're there to defend. And then contrast that to the tribe of scoundrels on the other side, which we'll go through here in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Griffin in Washington, D.C., directing your kind attention to Tarpley.net, and to the books that I've written, which are now available on that website. Look to the right-hand column on the Tarpley.net website. A lot of interest right now in the book on World War I, La France Conquise, by Edward VII and Clemenceau with my article about Edward VII, the evil demiurge of the Triple Entente. This gets down to bedrock. Don't listen to Max Hastings. Don't listen to Boris Johnson. Don't listen to Fritz Fischer. None of these historians, right, some with greater merit, some with less, are decisive. What's decisive is Edward VII, who wanted the war, who set it up, and after his death, his disciples carried it out. So take a look at Tarpley.net, the Geneva Conference. Well, the outcome of this is Ban Ki-moon must go. Ban Ki-moon must be fired. Ban Ki-moon must be removed. He must resign. He's got to go. We've had enough of Ban Ki-moon. This is an obvious puppet of the State Department, so obvious that it's just intolerable. It's pathetic. He can't even continue in office in his own terms. His puppetry has gone beyond all limits. Yeah, sure, going back to Dag Hammarskjöld in the 1950s, right? Sure, the head of the UN is going to be more inclined in favor of the Western powers than Moscow or Beijing or the Third World, but still, this has now gone beyond all limits. It's kind of like Kerry. Kerry has, in a sense, pulled him along with him. If Kerry believes what he says, he's nuts. He's got to be put into a straitjacket. If he doesn't believe it, he's an incompetent because he's trying to dish up a line which is simply impossible to believe. Does he live in a bubble? Is this the pillow talk of Teresa Heinz as they loll on their mattress full of $100 bills? I don't know what it is, but crazy. And now Ban Ki-moon. As of last week, we had, I guess it was on Sunday, the report that Ban Ki-moon, in a moment of lucidity, or perhaps after being threatened or cajoled by some enlightened diplomat, had said, okay, it's obvious that if there's a Geneva conference on Syria, that Iran must attend. And, of course, this is obvious to everybody. The whole State Department apparatus has been trying to prove that Iran is a party to the war in Syria, that they have sent in forces, the Quds Force, the Revolutionary Guards, and all the rest. So if they're a party to the conflict, this, of course, then means that they've got to be invited to the peace conference, but not for Kerry and not for the unfortunate Ban Ki-moon. No, it means that they've got to be excluded. And at the same time, as Jafari pointed out, the dignified and in many ways admirable, certainly courageous Syrian ambassador to the UN, Jafari pointed out, look, this conference has been packed. 40 states, right? Australia. What has Australia to do with the Middle East? Nothing, right? They've got some markers left over from Gallipoli, I suppose. But other than that, what does Australia have to do with the Middle East? What does Morocco, for that matter, have to do with the Levant? Precious little. But Iran, a party to the conflict, no, not them. This is absolutely insane. So with this already, Ban Ki-moon was discredited. And then, in the proceedings, he tries to chair this as if he were the schoolmaster of some kind of a rural one-room blab schoolhouse, and everybody gets 8 minutes. And when it comes to Moallem, a person of the Syrian foreign minister, Moallem, a person, once again, of massive dignity and courage, then he says to Moallem, wrap it up, will you? I'm sorry, every minute of Moallem's speech has been bought with Syrian blood, the blood of the Syrian Arab army resisting those despicable terrorists that have been shipped in by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. And so that was a moment of dignity where the scurrilous scoundrel nature of Ban Ki-moon came to the fore. This guy simply, he's got to be dumped. I would think the imperialists would have the sense to get rid of him. Hasn't he outlived his usefulness? Isn't this too obvious, right? Two affronts, two diplomatic incidents manufactured by this bungling fool in 1 week. And, of course, immorality, double standards, undoubtedly there. What I want to focus on, though, and I urge you to take a look at Tarpley.net, we put the entire speech of Moallem up there. It's 6 pages. It's not that long. This comes from the SANA, Syrian Arab News Agency site. I would thank SANA for putting that up. It is an excellent summary of what has happened, right? It is not, you don't get lost in detail, but it's quite readable. It's quite dramatic. This is what the imperialists objected to so much, right? The State Department thought this was inflammatory rhetoric. The Daily Telegraph thought it was long and florid. Well, better than the scurrilous raving of Jarba or the lies of Kerry. We'll go through some of the other people, but let me just give you some idea. I want to urge you, go to Tarpley.net and read Moallem's speech. Ban Ki-moon didn't want you to hear it. Aren't you curious what Ban Ki-moon didn't want the world to hear? I think you ought to be interested. He wanted to shut up Moallem. You get 8 minutes. No, I'm sorry. You get more than 8 minutes. It's a conference about Syria. Doesn't Syria get some kind of special status? Apparently not for these lunatics and madmen. They are fey. They have all the earmarks of a doomed ruling class. So Moallem proudly represents the Syrian Arab Republic. 7,000 years of history, it's Arab, and it's a republic, a civil state that some people sitting in this room have tried to return to the Middle Ages. An entire generation has been destroyed, and the Syrian delegation carries the hope of Syria for the years to come. And then he turns to the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, and he says, there are some people sitting among us in this room who are representatives of countries that have the blood of Syria on their hands, countries that have exported terrorism, along with clemency for the perpetrators. They have prevented believers from visiting the holy places of worship. This is Saudi Arabia, needless to say. They live in archaic glass houses. They lecture us in democracy. They are owned by kings and princes who rule the entire society. And these people are sitting here today. I'll give you some more from Moallem in just a minute. Again, you got to go and read it on Tarpley.net. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Griffin in Washington, D.C. Some more highlights from the speech by the Syrian Foreign Minister Moallem to the Montreux conference. He's attacking Saudi Arabia big time. He says the Saudis, in effect, have lectured Syria. They talk to us. They are immersed in the mud of slavery, because the Saudis have domestic slavery. I've written about this. The mud of slavery, infanticide, and other medieval practices. Their masks have fallen from their quivering faces to reveal their perverse ambitions. That might be Qatar. A desire to destabilize and destroy Syria by exporting their national product, which is terrorism. Now, 83 nationalities are fighting. Terrorists, jihadis. 83 nationalities are fighting in Syria. And you want to have a Syrian peace and a Syrian future? How can a Chechen, an Afghani, a Saudi, a Turk, a Frenchman, a British terrorist deliver on the aspirations of the Syrian people? Saudi Arabia knows nothing of Islam except perverse Wahhabism, says the courageous and dignified Moallem. And at this point, they're obviously apoplectic with rage. He goes through I won't go through you can read this, the details of the atrocities coming from this perverse doctrine. Obviously, the revolutionaries cannibalize a man's heart and do this in the name of democracy. He calls the people coming in freedom-fighting monsters, alien monsters who kill, loot, behead, slaughter, rape, and burn people alive. And that blood-soaked finger is then pointed at Assad and the Syrian army. The Saudi policy is to export human monsters fully soaked in the abhorrent Wahhabite ideology at the expense of Syrian blood. And now the geopolitical situation of Syria, they have not had good neighbors. The backstabbers in the north, Erdogan of Turkey. The silent bystanders to the truth in the west, Iraq, weak. This is Lebanon, weak. A weak south, accustomed to doing the bidding of others, Jordan, notorious. Or the tired and exhausted east, still reeling from the plots to destroy it. That's Iraq. He makes fun of Erdogan, of course, and how it blows back. This is important for all the imperialists. Notice how the magic eventually turns on the magician. And the Turkish policy has gone from zero problems to zero foreign policy, and they are left with zero credibility. Back to Saudi Arabia to attack Saeed Qutb. This was the anti-Nasser ideologue. This is essentially the fountainhead of the modern form of this crazy stuff. These were the opponents of the great President Nasser of Egypt. And, of course, Mohammed Abdel Wahab gets attacked. And they've been spreading havoc from Tunisia to Libya to Egypt and then to Syria, pursuing an illusion that exists only in their sick minds, says Moalem. And all of this is supposed to add up to the glorious Syrian revolution for democracy. He refutes the chemical weapons story. He says this is a fabricated story. The chemical weapons story has failed to convince even the American public, let alone the Syrians. They speak the language of blood, war, colonialism, and hegemony. And, of course, the people blowing themselves up in Syria today are the same ones who blew themselves up in New York over the past years. Then we have the Friends of Syria, right? These series of conferences, autocratic, oppressive monarchies who know nothing of a civil state, colonial powers, guilty of all the crimes. Those are the Friends of Syria. One of the things he points out a lot is that the sanctions on Syria include food. Remember, one of the horrendous things about the sanctions against Iraq is that they included food and medicine. The sanctions against Syria are the same, according to Moalem. The embargo, all of this, no food coming in. You want to do something simple for the Syrian people, lift these despicable economic warfare sanctions. And he says, the Syrians among us here, meaning Jarba, who's squirming in his seat, the Syrians among us here have been the facilitators and implementers of this at the expense of their own people. They sold themselves to Israel, becoming her eyes on the ground and her fingers on the trigger for Syria's destruction. This is a powerful speech. These people like Jarba have been living, he never mentions any of them by name. They've been living in five-star hotels, selling themselves to the highest foreign bidder. Well, you can't speak on behalf of the Syrian people if you're a traitor to their cause and an agent for their enemies. The freezing cold winters because of the lack of methane, right, of mazout, that's also due to these sanctions. The Syrian Arab Republic has welcomed hundreds of international journalists and facilitated their mobility, security, and access. Yes, it's true. I'm one of them. I can tell you. He's right. It's true. But there are other international journalists who are clandestine agents of certain parties sitting here. Now, turning to the rebels, the really big question. What have you done, you who claim to speak on behalf of the Syrian people? What is your vision for this great country? What are your ideas or your political manifesto? What are your agents of change on the ground other than your armed criminal gangs? What is the program? What do they want? They say, oh, well, Assad has to go. Yeah, then what? That's the leap into the dark. And, of course, have you built any schools or health centers? No. Have you guarded artifacts in museums? No. The only thing you've done is to disgrace yourselves by begging the United States to bomb Syria. That's the net result of these opposition forces. And he goes on, the Assad regime committed to defend Christian and Muslim, mentions Malula, the last community that speaks Aramaic, the language of Jesus Christ, and this is the Syrian policy of toleration. And this is real. This I have seen. This is absolutely real, be it Orthodox or Latin, Christianity, Melkite, whatever it is. This is all protected. He thanks Russia and China. Russia has been a true champion on the international stage. China, the BRICS countries, Iran, Iraq, and other Arab and Muslim countries, along with certain African and Latin American nations that have been involved. So the West is supporting Arab countries to supply lethal weapons to al-Qaeda. The West publicly claims to be fighting terrorism, while in fact it is covertly nourishing it. And the result, cannibalizing and butchery. We have to prevent the collapse of the entire Middle East to protect civilization, culture, and diversity, and to preserve the dialogue of civilizations in the birthplace of religion. We have come to protect tolerant Islam that has been distorted, and to protect the Christians of the Levant. A monumental speech. This is what Ban Ki-moon didn't want you to hear. Then he points out, whatever we agree here will be subject to a national referendum. The only people who can decide the legitimacy of a Syrian government, not Kerry or Theresa or Susan Rice, but a Syrian referendum. So Syria has been warning against the growth of this Wahhabite and al-Qaeda terrorism, and therefore proposes to continue on this. I can't do justice to it. You got to go to Tarpley.net and read the speech by Moallem. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Just a couple of other highlights from the conclusion, the peroration of Moallem's speech. The thing that Kerry and Ban Ki-moon didn't want you to hear, which is supposed to be inflammatory rhetoric, this seems to me to be a landmark of truth in the world of lies. So whatever is agreed to will be subjected to a referendum. Syrians choose their own government, not foreign conferences. Referendum, plebiscite. It's time to fight terrorism. U.S., France, Britain, Russia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all hit by terrorism. Why not cooperate to fight it with its horrifying and obscurantist ideology? The conference, he actually proposes, in effect, that the conference ought to be shifted into Syria. If it's supposed to deal with Syria, let's go to Syria. Some countries have been shedding innocent blood. Instead, we should have resorted to reason instead of terrorism and destruction. Use reason, not terrorism and destruction. So the invitation is fight terrorism and extremism, start a new political process, and reject the hypocrites, the false faces, who publicly smile, Kerry, but feed terrorist ideology, striking Syria today, but ultimately spreading to infect us all. That is the moment of truth and destiny, time to rise to the challenge. So that's Moallem. That's the speech of his life, and one of the great ones of our time. So I urge you to take a look at that and study it. You gain real insight into how the Arab world and the struggle within Islam looks from within. Of course, Kerry, the arrogant imperialist with virtually no connection to reality. Fabius, le Tartuffe, the hypocrite. Oh, he's so concerned about the humanitarian crisis He wants immediate ceasefires where it will help preserve terrorist units, and he wants humanitarian corridors, which means armed intervention. Haig also wretched. This guy Jarba is a beady-eyed snake. And we have to say a good word about Lavrov, even keel, fair, gets the merit of having brought this about. Right? This is Putin and Lavrov are essentially responsible for opening up this possibility. So again, to sum it up, what did we get from the Western powers? We got more barf from Harf. We got more hanky-panky from Banky. And we got more pus from Fabius. Harf, of course, is Madame or Mademoiselle Marie Harf, the deputy spokes of the State Department, right? She's second to Madame Saki. But barf from Harf is what you're hearing at the State Department briefings. Kerry made a great deal of a report about 11,000 victims, supposedly, of Assad's jails, but the MIT report, Massachusetts Institute of Technology report, showing that it is virtually impossible for the Syrian army to have launched these gas attacks, whatever they were, nothing, not cited by the Western powers. And, of course, we don't really have all the statements of all the 40 foreign ministers who were all, it was all divided up among them, right? 8 minutes. I suppose Ban Ki-moon invited 10 more so that he could keep Moalam even shorter. But Moalam will be heard, and I urge you, make sure Ban Ki-moon doesn't prevent you from studying that thing on by Moalam. As I was watching this, I was thinking, this is the way the League of Nations died. This is the death rattle of the United Nations unless something is done. You cannot have somebody who is this crude of a partisan, right? So much prejudice, so much animus, so much venom, and so inept, such a bungler as Ban Ki-moon. Who's the historical parallel? Well, there was a guy called Joseph Avenol, Avenol. And this Joseph Avenol was the General Secretary of the League of Nations in Geneva, same places. That's where they are now. They're back from Montreux. They've gone to Geneva. From 1933 to 1940, Joseph Avenol was the Secretary General of the League of Nations, and he was a fascist. He was a Vichyssois. He later on tried to join Marshal Pétain and the fascist regime, and what he did was, when Italy attacked Ethiopia, he sympathized with Italy. When Japan attacked Manchuria, he sympathized with Japan. When Germany quit the League of Nations, he tried to get them back. When the Japanese quit, he tried to get them back. And he was mainly concerned in the Munich crisis. He didn't want Germany to be offended by any of the speeches. So this was an appeaser, a fascist collaborator, Joseph Avenol, and he was the gravedigger of the League of Nations. Right? It limped on from 1940 to 1946 under an Irishman, but in effect it was a dead institution, and that is the danger that we're in right now. So international anarchy looms. Now, I guess we ought to go directly to Ukraine after that, because that is the parallel case that is now developing, and where this insanity of the State Department and Kerry in particular is coming to the fore. I don't know whether Obama shares in this or not. He may well, but I'm afraid it seems to be Kerry who is making up these things. Got to remember also, Kerry's wife, Teresa Heinz, comes from Salazar, Portugal. In other words, the fascist regime of Salazar in Portugal and the colonial situation of the late Salazar regime is essentially where she comes from. So he may be getting this kind of pro-fascist line in his in his private life through his various contacts